It started as a quiet morning in New York City, the kind where the sky looks silver before sunrise and the streets hum with early taxis. I told my husband I'd be gone for a week, a simple trip to visit my sister in Vermont. He smiled too easily, kissed my forehead, and said he'd miss me. But there was something in that smile that didn't belong, so I decided to test it. My suitcase wasn't for travel, it was for truth. I wanted to see who he became when he thought I wasn't watching. Well, I'm glad you're here. If you're listening, please like this video, subscribe, and tell me from where you're watching. And drop a heart if you've ever doubted someone you love. When I told my husband I'd be leaving for a week, I made sure my voice didn't shake. After 40 years of marriage, I had learned that lies don't always come with raised voices. Sometimes they come with calm smiles. He nodded, too casually, as if he had been waiting for me to suggest it. That was the first sign. Most men would ask what to pack, what time I'd be back, or if I'd call. He didn't. He just asked which train I'd take. His ease unsettled me more than any argument could have. That night, I packed lightly, just enough to make the lie believable. A few dresses, some toiletries, and an old book he'd given me on our 10th anniversary. I wanted it to look like a harmless visit to my sister's home. I even called my sister beforehand, asking her to play along in case he phoned. She hesitated, then whispered, "Be careful." She didn't have to explain. She knew the tone I'd heard in his voice, the one that said something had shifted in the dark corners of our marriage. The next morning, I kissed his cheek, thanked him for carrying my bag, and stepped into the cab. From the window, I watched him wave from the porch. He didn't look sad. He looked relieved. That's when I knew my suspicions weren't paranoia. They were intuition. Women of my age don't need evidence. We feel betrayal long before we see it. But instead of heading to the train station, I asked the driver to take me to a small inn across town, about 20 minutes from home. The inn sat behind a row of oak trees, quiet and unassuming, the perfect place to disappear without leaving. I checked in under my maiden name, paid in cash, and took the room by the corner window. From there, I could see the faint outline of our neighborhood on the hill. It wasn't far. It was close enough to watch. That evening, I called my husband just once. I told him I had arrived safely and that my sister sent her love. He sounded distracted, his voice light, cheerful, as if a weight had been lifted. When I hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time, staring at the streetlights flickering through the curtains. The air felt colder than usual. I thought of all the years I had given him, the birthdays remembered, the dinners cooked, the forgiveness handed out too easily, and now I was testing the man I thought I knew better than myself. The first day passed quietly. I walked through town, bought a small notebook, and began writing everything I remembered. The late-night phone calls, the missed dinners, the sudden business trips that didn't add up. I wasn't angry yet. I was preparing myself for the moment I'd no longer have to wonder. On the second night, I stood by the window, looking toward our street. The house lights were on. Through the trees, I could see the faint shimmer of movement in the living room. A shadow passed by the curtains. It could have been him. It could have been anyone. I felt my pulse quicken, not out of jealousy, but out of the cold realization that I might soon lose the version of my life I had believed in for decades. I thought about going back that night, just walking in, unannounced, and demanding the truth, but that would have ruined the test. I wanted to see not just if he would betray me, but how he would behave when he thought no one was watching. Betrayal doesn't always start with another woman. Sometimes it starts with comfort, the kind that grows when loyalty stops being challenged. On the third night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the small lamp in the inn's corner, flipping through the old book I had packed, the one with his handwriting on the first page. To my wife, who makes every place feel like home. I laughed bitterly under my breath. Home. The word had become a question, not a place. At dawn, I decided to act. I called my sister, told her not to worry, and hung up before she could ask questions. Then I dressed in simple clothes, tied my hair back, and took a cab back toward our neighborhood. My stomach felt heavy, but my hands were steady. As the house came into view, I told the driver to stop 2 streets away. I got out and walked the rest of the way on foot. The world looked the same mailbox, the same roses by the gate, but everything felt different. The home I had built with trust now looked like a stage, and I was about to see the play unfold. That was the day I promised myself one thing. Whatever I discovered inside, I wouldn't let it break me. I'd let it reveal me, because sometimes the only way to know what love is worth is to see what survives after the truth walks in. Doubt doesn't arrive like thunder. It seeps in quietly, like water through a crack. In the days before I left, I had already started noticing little shifts in my husband. Changes too small to accuse, but too strange to ignore. He used to hum when reading the newspaper, a little habit from our early days. But lately, silence had replaced the music. He'd glance at his phone more than he looked at me. When I asked harmless questions, about dinner or his work, he'd answer with half words, as though my voice was something he had to walk through rather than listen to. I remember one evening clearly. I had made his favorite meal, roast chicken with thyme, mashed potatoes, and green beans. He ate it without a word, scrolling through his phone, pretending to be busy. The man who once used to thank me for cooking after a long day now treated it like a routine chore. Marriage teaches you many things. One of them is how to feel rejection without hearing it spoken. His eyes had changed. They no longer softened when they met mine. They just glanced, like checking the weather before walking outside. I told myself it was age, that maybe we were just growing distant because of time. But then the small things started to multiply. Late-night calls that ended abruptly when I walked into the room. Receipts from restaurants in places he claimed he never went. And the way he started staying at work past midnight, though he'd retired a year ago. I kept the suspicions to myself because that's what older women are taught. Keep the peace, don't assume, and pray that you're wrong. But inside, my heart already knew the answer. It wasn't just betrayal I feared. It was humiliation. The idea that after decades of building a life, raising a family, sharing the same bed, the person beside me might already be living another life I wasn't invited to. I looked at our wedding photo on the mantel one night. His arm around me, both of us smiling, the world still wide open ahead. That picture felt like someone else's story now. The version of us in that frame didn't match the strangers we had become. Every time I tried to ignore the signs, something new would appear. One evening, I found a perfume scent on his jacket. Not mine, not the faint trace of old cologne, but something sweet and unfamiliar. When I mentioned it, he shrugged and said it must have been from someone at the office. But he hadn't worked in months. That's when the feeling turned from confusion to certainty. He was hiding something, whether it was another woman, another secret, or another truth I wasn't ready to hear. It's strange the way instinct works. You start noticing rhythms that don't make sense. He would shower twice a day, start ironing shirts he hadn't worn in years, and keep the bathroom door locked longer than usual. He was nervous, not the kind of nervousness that comes from guilt, but the kind that comes from fear of being found out. I began studying his patterns like a detective, the sound of the front door closing, the hours he returned, the days he suddenly became too cheerful. But beneath all the doubt was something softer, heartbreak. Because even before I had proof, I missed him. I missed the man who once held my hand through hospital visits, who built a garden for me when I turned 60, who promised he'd never give me a reason to doubt his loyalty. I didn't just fear losing him, I feared losing the version of myself who still believed in him. By the week of my trip, the house felt hollow. Conversations were clipped, laughter replaced by routine. He started walking past me instead of toward me. When I hugged him goodbye that morning, I felt the stiffness in his shoulders. He didn't hold on. He didn't even look back when I shut the door. And that's when I knew, whatever I was about to discover, it had already started long before I decided to test him. My absence wouldn't create the truth. It would only reveal what had been waiting for the right moment to show itself. As I sat in the inn that first night, I thought about everything. the quiet dinners, the perfume, the strange distance, and I realized that love doesn't die in one big moment. It dies in small pieces, scattered across years of silence. And maybe that's what I was trying to do. Not catch him cheating, but catch what was left of the love we once promised would never change. When I checked into that small inn, I felt a strange mix of fear and control. Fear because I didn't know what I was about to discover, and control because for the first time in years, I was the one observing, not reacting. The room was small, with pale yellow curtains and a single wooden chair by the window. From that window, if I leaned slightly, I could see the faint glow of our streetlights through the trees. My home was just over the hill, close enough to reach, far enough to stay hidden. I made a list that night, a simple one. Day 1, watch. Day 2, listen. Day 3, decide. It wasn't a plan for revenge or confrontation. It was a plan for understanding. I needed to know if I was losing my mind or if the man I shared a life with had already slipped into another. I spent the first evening doing nothing but watching the clock. Every hour that passed made me question my decision more. What if I was wrong? What if he really was just tired, just distant, just aging like me, slower, quieter, detached? But then I remembered that relief in his smile when I said I was leaving. That was enough to quiet my guilt. Around 7 p.m., I walked past our house from the opposite side of the street, pretending to be a passerby. The curtains were open halfway, lights on in the living room. He sat in his armchair, reading something, calm, relaxed, not a man missing his wife. On the table beside him were 2 glasses. 2. My chest tightened. I walked faster, afraid I'd be seen, but also afraid of stopping to think. That night, I sat awake at the inn, the sound of cars outside my window blending with my thoughts. Every shadow looked like an answer I didn't want. I tried to tell myself that maybe the second glass was for water, or maybe he had company, a friend, a neighbor, anything that wasn't what I feared. But my heart didn't believe my excuses. Women like me stopped trusting words long before we stopped trusting ourselves. The next morning, I went for a walk around the block, keeping close enough to home to see patterns. I noticed how early he left, even though he didn't work anymore. I noticed how carefully he checked the windows before getting into his car. The small details that once meant nothing now became evidence. He was hiding something, but I didn't yet know what. By evening, I had grown restless. I couldn't spend another night just wondering. I went to a nearby cafe with a clear view of our street. I ordered coffee I didn't drink, pretending to read a newspaper while watching his car pull into the driveway. A woman walked by, stopped at the gate, and he came out to greet her. They didn't touch, but the comfort between them was too familiar. It wasn't love in the young sense. No hugs, no stolen kisses, but the kind of quiet understanding that comes from shared secrets. She handed him a folder, and they both went inside. For an hour, I just sat there, my hands trembling on the cup, the heat long gone. The air outside had turned cold, but I barely noticed. My world had split into 2, the one I had built with him, and the one he had quietly built without me. I didn't know who that woman was, and for a strange moment, I didn't even want to. I just needed to understand why. When I returned to the inn that night, I felt a calm I couldn't explain. It wasn't peace, it was acceptance. The kind of acceptance that comes when you realize the truth will hurt, but living blind will hurt worse. I took out my notebook and wrote everything I'd seen, every detail, every time, every face, because when the heart breaks, the mind starts keeping records. On the 3rd night, I decided I would no longer stay on the outside looking in. I needed to be closer, to see the truth from within the walls I once called mine. I knew then that pretending to be gone wasn't enough. The real test would be what happened when I returned unannounced. And whatever I found, I promised myself one thing. This time, I wouldn't cry quietly. This time, I'd let the truth show itself, no matter how dark it was. By the 3rd night, my nerves had become sharper than glass. Sleep was impossible. My thoughts moved too fast to rest. I sat by the inn window, watching the fog roll across the streetlights, thinking about how trust, once broken, doesn't just hurt, it humiliates. Every small sound outside made me twitch. Every car that passed made me wonder if it was his. The part of me that still hoped for innocence was fighting with the part that already knew guilt. Around 10 p.m., I couldn't sit still any longer. I wrapped my shawl tightly, stepped outside, and began walking toward our street. The cold air bit at my face, but my heart was hot, pounding, wild. The sky was a dull gray, and the road shimmered faintly under the weak light. I remember thinking how strange it was that the world could stay so calm when mine was about to split open. When I reached the corner of our street, I slowed my steps. Our house stood at the far end, familiar and foreign all at once. The front lights were on. Through the half-drawn curtains, I could see the faint flicker of the television, but the sound was off. His car was parked neatly in the driveway. Next to it sat another, a silver sedan, sleek and modern, the kind neither of us could afford on a whim. My breath caught. I waited, staring, frozen in the shadows like a ghost haunting her own life. For 10 minutes, nothing moved. Then, through the window, I saw a silhouette, my husband's shape unmistakable. He walked across the room carrying something in his hands, paused, then another figure appeared beside him, a woman, younger by her outline. My vision blurred for a moment, maybe from tears, maybe from rage. I didn't blink. I couldn't. She leaned toward him, said something, and laughed softly. I could almost feel that laughter, the way it pierced through the quiet like a knife scraping against glass. He smiled. That small, familiar smile he hadn't shown me in months. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was worse. It was natural, comfortable, as if this wasn't the first time. My mind went numb, my heart trying to make sense of what my eyes already knew. The silver car, the second glass, the sudden calm when I said I'd be gone. Everything fit. Every missing piece of affection had been given somewhere else. I wasn't angry, not yet. Anger would have been easier. What I felt was something deeper, quieter. The grief that comes when you realize someone didn't break your heart suddenly. They let it die slowly, night after night, until all that's left is the echo of who they used to be. I stayed there for nearly an hour, hidden behind the thick hedges near the mailbox. My legs ached, but I didn't move. I wanted to memorize everything, the lights, the shadows, the distance between them. I needed to carry proof inside me, not just suspicion. The clock on my phone said midnight when the woman finally left. He walked her to the door, touched her shoulder lightly as she stepped into the car, then stood there for a while after she drove away. His expression wasn't guilt, it was peace. When he finally turned off the lights and disappeared into the house, I turned and walked back toward the inn. The road felt longer than before. My chest felt hollow, and every step echoed in my ears like the sound of something final. I didn't cry until I reached my room, and even then, it wasn't loud. Just quiet sobs into the pillow, the kind that don't come from shock but from recognition. Because deep down, I had always known. I just needed to see it with my own eyes to stop pretending. That night, I made a decision. I would go back home, not as his wife returning from a trip, but as the woman who no longer needed to ask questions. If he had built another life inside my walls, then I would let him keep the walls. But I would take back everything else, my name, my strength, my silence. By dawn, the fog outside had lifted and the sky turned pale blue. I packed my things, folded the shawl carefully, and whispered to myself, "It's time." The morning I decided to return home felt colder than any winter I'd lived through. Not because of the weather, but because I knew I was walking into the remains of something that used to be whole. I packed my suitcase quietly, folded every piece of clothing with a calm that didn't feel like mine. By the time I zipped it shut, I had stopped shaking. There's a kind of stillness that comes when heartbreak turns into purpose. I didn't want answers anymore. I wanted truth, even if it hurt to look at. The streets were quiet when I called a taxi. The driver asked where I was headed, and I said, home. The word tasted strange on my tongue. It used to mean comfort. Now it meant confrontation. As the car turned down the familiar road, my heart started beating faster. My house stood at the end. The garden I planted years ago now half wilted, curtains half drawn, lights flickering through them. My husband's car was parked neatly in the driveway again, and beside it, that same silver sedan. The driver asked if I wanted him to wait. I said no. Whatever happened next, I needed to face it alone. I stepped out slowly, suitcase in hand, pretending to be the woman who had forgotten something, not the wife who had come back from a lie. My shoes crunched against the gravel. Every step toward the door felt heavier, as though the house itself could feel my suspicion pressing against its walls. The front door wasn't locked. That detail hurt more than it should have. He never left it unlocked when we were together. Inside, the air smelled faintly of perfume, not mine, lighter, floral, careless. There were 2 coffee cups on the counter, both half empty. A coat, not mine, hung on the back of the chair. And from the living room, I heard it. Laughter. Soft, casual laughter. The kind that had been missing from our marriage for years. I froze by the doorway. The curtains were half open, and through them, I could see him, sitting on the sofa with the same young woman I'd seen before. She wasn't leaning on him. She wasn't touching him. But their closeness spoke louder than any embrace. They were sorting through papers spread across the table. She passed him an envelope with my name written across it in his handwriting. My stomach dropped. I wanted to storm in, demand answers, throw everything I'd seen in his face, but something stopped me. A quiet voice inside said, "Wait." I took a step back, heart pounding so loud it filled my ears. I watched for a few more seconds, just enough to see him sigh, rub his eyes, and hand her something from a folder. She nodded, wiped her eyes, and smiled, not the smile of a lover. It was gentler, almost grateful. I realized then that I didn't understand what I was seeing. This wasn't romance. It was something else, something I didn't yet have the pieces for. So I left. I walked out quietly, closing the door as softly as I could. My hands were trembling, but my mind was steady. The truth wasn't what I thought it was, but it was still there, waiting for me. Back at the inn, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my suitcase. For a long time, I said nothing, thought nothing. Then, I packed again, slower this time. I would go back the next day, not as a spy, not as a woman guessing shadows, but as his wife ready to hear the truth, whatever shape it took. That night, I didn't cry. For the first time in weeks, I slept, not peacefully, but completely, because I had finally stopped running from what I already knew deep down, that the person I once trusted had built a world I wasn't part of anymore. But before I walked away for good, I needed to look him in the eyes and hear him say it himself. Morning came fast. When I looked out the window, the silver sedan was gone. Only his car remained. The air outside was crisp, the kind that smells of rain and endings. I took one last look at the room, closed my suitcase, and whispered to myself, "Whatever waits behind that door, I'm ready now." When I returned that evening, the house felt unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that doesn't belong to peace, but to something waiting to break. My husband was in the living room, still at the table, the same pile of papers in front of him. He looked up when I entered, startled. For a second, his face flickered, confusion, guilt, then a strange kind of calm, as if he had already rehearsed this moment in his mind. I set my suitcase down gently by the door. My shoes felt heavy. I could hear my own heartbeat echoing through the room. On the table lay that same envelope with my name scrawled across it, the one I'd seen in the woman's hands the day before. The sight of it sent a wave of nausea through me, but I held my ground. I didn't want shouting, or tears, or explanations. I wanted truth, plain and bare, the kind that either fixes what's broken or buries it for good. He didn't speak at first. He just watched me. The woman wasn't there anymore, but her presence still hung in the air, faint perfume, the smell of coffee, the imprint of her coat on the chair. Without a word, I walked over to the table and placed my hand on the envelope. My fingers trembled slightly, though I didn't want him to see it. Slowly, I pulled it toward me. The paper inside was thick, official, deliberate. When I opened it, I expected something cruel, divorce papers, a confession, proof of betrayal, but what I saw instead stopped my breath. It was a birth certificate, old, yellowed slightly around the edges. My husband's name printed neatly beside the word father. Beneath it, a name I didn't recognize, a girl's, the same last name, the same blood. He stood there quietly, eyes glistening, his lips trembling like he'd been waiting for years to let the truth out but never found the courage. For a long moment, we didn't speak. I kept reading, hoping there was a mistake, a misunderstanding, anything. But the date matched, the handwriting matched, everything was real. Then it hit me. The woman, the papers, the strange, careful tone in his voice whenever I mentioned money or trips. She wasn't a lover. She was his daughter. A child from before me. One he never told me about. One he'd apparently just met. My knees felt weak. I sank slowly into the chair across from him, still holding the certificate. He started explaining, his voice low, shaking. He'd met her mother long before we ever knew each other. They had separated before the girl was born. He never even knew she existed until months ago when she reached out through a lawyer. She wanted to meet her father, not for money, not for pity, just to know where she came from. I didn't cry. Not yet, because my tears didn't know whether to come from relief or pain. Relief that he hadn't cheated on me. Pain that he had hidden a part of himself, a part of our story, for so long. I thought back to the last few years, the distance, the quiet, the restless nights. He wasn't hiding guilt over infidelity. He was hiding shame. Shame for a past he thought would destroy the life we built together. He'd spent months secretly meeting this young woman, helping her find closure, trying to figure out how to tell me without breaking me. And in that effort, he had nearly broken me anyway. I sat there staring at the photograph clipped inside the file. The woman's younger self as a child, smiling. It wasn't the face of betrayal. It was the face of a lost child finding home again. I could almost see pieces of him in her. His eyes, his quietness, the tilt of her smile. Suddenly, all my anger deflated. I wasn't furious anymore. I was exhausted. Exhausted from building stories in my head to fill the silence he should have spoken through. He reached out his hand across the table. I didn't take it right away. I just looked at it. That same hand that had held mine through years of sickness, funerals, loneliness. And for the first time, I realized how fragile even long love can be when built on partial truths. When I finally looked up at him, he whispered that he was sorry, that he thought he was protecting me from pain, that he didn't want to lose me over something that happened before I existed in his world. And maybe that was the saddest part. He had chosen secrecy over trust, fear over honesty. I folded the paper gently, placed it back in the envelope, and said nothing. Some truths don't need an answer. They just need to sit between two people until the air feels breathable again. That night, for the first time, I understood that betrayal doesn't always come with infidelity. Sometimes it comes quietly, disguised as protection. That night, after the truth had settled between us like dust in an empty room, I realized silence could only hold so much. The next morning, I decided we needed to face it, not as strangers hiding behind excuses, but as two people who had spent decades building a life on half-truths. When he walked into the kitchen, his eyes were tired, and for once, he didn't try to smile. He knew what was coming. I laid the envelope on the table again, this time beside our wedding photo, the one taken in a small chapel on the outskirts of Chicago. The contrast was cruel. In one, we were smiling with certainty. In the other, a piece of paper revealed how much we didn't know about each other. He sat across from me, hands clasped, eyes lowered. The clock ticked between us, marking the seconds like tiny reminders that no moment, once gone, ever comes back the same. I asked him why. Not why he had a child. I understood life before me existed. But why he thought I couldn't handle the truth. He said he didn't want to burden me with his past, that he wanted to protect what we had. But what he didn't see was that secrecy doesn't protect. It isolates. For years, I had felt the growing distance, the invisible wall, the way he drifted through days like a man half living. I used to think it was work, age, exhaustion. I never thought it was guilt. As he spoke, his voice cracked. He told me about meeting the girl's mother when he was young, a brief chapter, long closed. She'd moved away before she knew she was pregnant. He'd found out only months ago when the woman's daughter reached out through an ancestry website. She wasn't angry, he said, just curious. She wanted to know who she came from. She'd spent her whole life wondering about her father. And when she found him, she discovered he was a man too scared to face his own history. He told me he had met her a few times secretly, at cafes near her workplace, that she was kind, that she didn't want money, only to know the person who gave her half her face. Each time, he came home quieter, not because he was ashamed of her, but because he was ashamed of himself. He didn't know how to tell me. He thought I'd see it as betrayal, not as the echo of a mistake made before I even existed in his story. Listening to him, something strange happened inside me. The anger that had burned all week began to cool. What replaced it wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. I could see the years he had carried this burden, the fear etched in the lines of his face. Love doesn't disappear because someone hides the truth. It just changes shape. I told him I needed time. I needed to think about whether I could live with the shadow of this secret now that it had a name and a face. He nodded, eyes down, tears clinging to the corners like they were afraid to fall. For once, we were both quiet, not out of avoidance, but because words couldn't fix what honesty had undone. That night, he left the photo and the envelope on my bedside table, as if returning ownership of something he'd kept locked away for too long. I stared at it for hours, tracing the young girl's smile with my fingers. She had his eyes, our son's eyes. The resemblance was undeniable. It wasn't her fault, or even his, not entirely. It was the silence that had done the damage, silence that pretended to protect, but only deepened the wound. When morning came, I walked into the living room and told him to sit. He did. I said we would meet her, together. Not to fix the past, but to finally stop living around it. His head lifted, eyes wide, relief breaking through the guilt. I wasn't doing it for him. I was doing it for peace, mine, his, and that young woman's. As I poured coffee, the house felt lighter for the first time in years. The air moved differently, as though truth had finally cracked a window open after too long in darkness. I didn't know what the future would look like, but I knew this. I couldn't rebuild love on the foundation of secrets. It had to start again, raw, honest, human. And as he reached across the table this time, I took his hand, not because I had forgotten, but because I was ready to see what love looked like when it stopped hiding. The days that followed were quieter than usual, almost fragile. We didn't speak much, but the silence between us had changed. It wasn't filled with suspicion anymore, just the weight of understanding. Every morning, I found him sitting in the kitchen, reading the same newspaper he'd read for years, his hands trembling slightly as he turned each page. He wasn't the same man, and neither was I. Something between us had shifted permanently. It wasn't anger that remained, but the hollow ache of finally seeing someone fully, flaws, fear, and all. When I looked at him now, I didn't see betrayal in the traditional sense. What I saw was a man who had spent years trying to outrun his past, only to realize it had been living under his skin all along. I started to ask gentle questions about that time in his life, questions I'd avoided before, where he was living back then, who he was with, how it all ended. At first, he hesitated. Then, one evening after dinner, he spoke slowly, almost as though every word hurt to pull out. He told me that before we met, he had been in a short relationship with a woman named Laura. They were young and uncertain, both chasing work, both running from broken families. He said she had left without explanation after a few months. He assumed she'd moved on and life carried him elsewhere. By the time we met, he hadn't thought of her in years. What he didn't know was that she'd been pregnant when she left. She never contacted him, and he never looked for her. "I thought I was free," he said softly. But I wasn't. When the letter came months ago, written by a lawyer on behalf of a young woman claiming to be his daughter, he nearly threw it away. He thought it was a scam. Then he saw her name, the same last name as Laura's, and something inside him broke open. He met her in secret at first. He told her everything about his life, about me, about our family. He wanted to be sure before he brought the truth home. But the moment he saw her in person, he said, he didn't need a DNA test. Her eyes, her smile, they were his. I listened, every word carving another piece off the wall of bitterness I'd built. This wasn't the story of a man cheating or lying to destroy me. It was the story of a man who had lived in quiet shame, too frightened to believe he could be forgiven for something that happened before me. I wanted to be angry still. I really did. But as he spoke, I saw the boy he used to be. The one who made mistakes before he learned what commitment meant. Still, I couldn't ignore how long he'd kept it from me. The secrecy wasn't about protecting me, it was about protecting himself. That was what hurt the most. Marriage, I realized, isn't only about love, it's about courage. The courage to tell the truth even when it might break what you've built. He hadn't trusted me enough to let me in, and that wound ran deeper than the secret itself. The next morning, I went for a walk to clear my mind. The world looked different, though it hadn't changed at all. I thought about Laura, about how many years she must have lived carrying that secret alone. I thought about the young woman who grew up without knowing her father's face. And then I thought about myself, the wife who had lived beside a man with a shadowed heart and never noticed how heavy it was. When I returned home, he was in the garden, trimming the roses. I stood there quietly for a while, watching him. There was something almost poetic in the way he worked, slow, careful, deliberate, like a man trying to prune the past without killing what was left of the present. When he finally looked up, our eyes met. He didn't speak, and he didn't have to. That single glance said everything: regret, fear, relief. That night, we sat together without words. The photo of the girl, his daughter, rested on the table between us. I picked it up once more. She was smiling, sunlight catching the corner of her hair. She didn't look like guilt or scandal. She looked like someone who had been waiting her whole life to belong somewhere. And suddenly, I realized, she didn't need to take something from me. She needed a place to return to. The truth behind the secret wasn't infidelity or betrayal. It was a man's fear of facing the weight of his own history, and a woman's realization that love isn't destroyed by the past, only reshaped by it. I thought of all the years wasted in silence, all the laughter that could have filled them. Secrets, I learned, don't always kill marriages. Sometimes they reveal what's worth saving. Weeks later, after the truth had softened into something we could both breathe around, the meeting finally happened. It wasn't planned as much as it was necessary. She had written to him again, asking to meet properly, not in secret, not in shadows, but as family. He showed me the message, his hands shaking slightly. He didn't ask for permission. He asked for courage. I nodded, and we set a date. We met at a small diner near the coast, the kind of place where the smell of coffee lingers longer than conversations. The moment I walked in, I recognized her. She didn't need to introduce herself. Her eyes were his, that same tired kindness, the same hesitant smile. She stood when she saw us, hands clasped, nervous but hopeful. I felt my chest tighten, not with anger, but with the weight of all the years that had led to this single moment. She wasn't a threat. She was a missing piece, and the closer I got to her, the more I realized how much she had lived without. Not just a father, but a history. No one should have to grow up wondering which half of themselves was missing. She didn't come looking for money or apologies. She came for truth. We sat together in silence at first, 3 lives tangled by choices none of us could undo. My husband looked smaller that day, humbled. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked. So I spoke instead, not as his wife, but as a woman who understood what it meant to live with unanswered questions. I asked about her life, her work, her mother. She answered with care, afraid of saying too much, afraid of scaring me away. As we talked, I realized something painful. She wasn't angry with him. She was grateful. Grateful that after so many years, she finally had someone to call Dad. Her forgiveness came easier than mine. Maybe that's how youth works. It hasn't learned how heavy resentment can become when carried too long. At one point, she reached into her purse and pulled out an old photograph. It was of her as a child, sitting on a front step, hair tied in a ribbon. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words, "For the father I never met." My husband broke down. Right there, in that small diner full of strangers, he wept. The kind of cry that doesn't make a sound, only trembles through the air. For years, I had thought betrayal meant deceit. But watching him crumble in front of this woman, his daughter, I saw something else. This wasn't betrayal. This was redemption dressed in regret. He had spent decades punishing himself quietly for a sin he didn't even know he'd committed. Now he was being forgiven by the very person he thought he'd lost forever. I didn't reach for him right away. I watched. I needed to see the man I had married, the one beneath the secrets, the one stripped bare of pride. And I saw him, not as my husband, not as a liar, but as a man who finally understood that love doesn't survive on silence. It survives on truth, even when truth arrives late. When we left the diner, the air felt different. The ocean wind carried something clean, almost new. She hugged him first, long and trembling. Then she turned to me. I didn't expect her to, but she did. She said quietly, "Thank you for not walking away." I didn't answer. I just held her for a moment, and in that small space, I felt forgiveness move through all of us like a tide returning to shore. That night, at home, the house felt alive again. The air wasn't heavy, the silence wasn't cruel. My husband sat beside me on the couch. No words, just peace. I looked at him and thought about all the versions of him I had met. The young man full of dreams, the husband who worked late, the father who grieved too deeply, the man who hid too long. And now this one, the man who had finally told the truth. It had taken a lifetime, but I finally understood. Some revelations don't destroy marriages. They cleanse them. They strip away the lies, the illusions, until what's left is something raw, real, and painfully human. That evening, after the meeting, I sat alone by the window while the last light faded outside. The sky looked different, not brighter, but softer, as if the world itself understood that some battles aren't meant to end in victory or loss, but in quiet acceptance. My husband was asleep on the couch, his hand still holding the photo of the daughter he had only just begun to know. For the first time in a long time, his face looked peaceful. The lines of guilt and fear were gone, replaced by something that looked almost like relief. I thought about the woman I used to be before all this, the wife who trusted without question, the woman who thought secrets only lived in other people's marriages. I had built my life around predictability, around knowing everything that touched our home. And yet, life had proven that no matter how much you plan, there are always corners of the heart that remain unexplored, even in the people you think you know best. Looking back, I realized something powerful. My husband hadn't betrayed me with love. He had betrayed me with fear. Fear of judgment, fear of losing what we had, fear of confronting a truth that might change everything. But it wasn't the truth that nearly broke us. It was the silence. That's the part no one warns you about. Silence, in a marriage, is a slow kind of poison. It doesn't kill overnight. It eats away at trust one unspoken moment at a time. But when silence finally breaks and the truth stands bare before you, you're faced with a choice. You can use it as a weapon to destroy what's left, or as a key to unlock something deeper. I chose the second path, not because it was easy, but because I was tired of carrying pain that didn't belong to me. Forgiveness isn't a reward, it's freedom. It's deciding that someone else's mistakes will not decide the rest of your life. In the days that followed, the young woman, his daughter, began visiting us often. She brought light into the house again. Her laughter filled rooms that had once been heavy with grief. My husband slowly came back to life. He talked more, smiled more, even sang while making breakfast. It was strange, but beautiful, to see how truth, even painful truth, could repair what years of comfort had quietly damaged. I didn't expect to love her, but I did. She reminded me of our younger days, when hope felt effortless. She didn't replace our son or rewrite our story. She simply added another chapter. Sometimes life gives you family in ways you never imagined, and sometimes forgiveness is the only bridge that keeps love from drowning in regret. As for me, I found peace not in forgetting, but in understanding. The truth didn't make me smaller, it made me stronger. I learned that age doesn't mean you've seen everything. Even in our later years, life has ways of teaching us lessons about grace, patience, and courage. So now, when people ask me what happened, when they expect a story of anger, betrayal, and revenge, I smile. Because what they'll never understand is that this wasn't a story of punishment. It was a story of redemption, a story about how even after decades of marriage, you can still learn who your partner truly is. And maybe that's what love really means. Not the absence of secrets, but the strength to face them when they finally come into the light. So, if you're watching this right now, I'll ask you what I asked myself the night I found that photograph. If you discovered your partner had a past they were too afraid to share, a mistake, a secret, a life you never knew, what would you do? Would you run from it? Would you burn it all down? Or would you sit quietly, take a breath, and decide to see the person, not just the past? Because sometimes, forgiveness isn't about them. It's about setting yourself free. If you're still here, thank you for listening to my story. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. And drop a heart, not for the pain, but for the truth that set us all free.